Just last week, the Informer interviewed Dr. Petrovsky about his decision to crowdfund the return of his COVID vaccine, Covax, back to Australia for the TGA approval. Now, following the federal government's refusal to fund the development of Covax, Professor Petrovsky has turned to crowdfunding. Now, on last check, just before we came on the interview, had a look, $140,000 has been raised. What does that tell you about our population's confidence in Professor Petrovsky versus our government? Well, today he joins us to discuss how it's going. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
$140,000 in 7 days. How do you feel?
Look, I think what I would emphasise is, that's been donated by over 1,500 Australians who are not just supporting our campaign, but actually putting hard-earned dollars into it because the government isn't. And, the emails and letters of support that we've had from people all over Australia has been really overwhelming. And these are everyday Australians, so when they put $100 into this, you can be sure it's a hard-earned $100. It's not a political $100 of someone else's money. This is real money, and they're putting it behind a real vaccine. And that funding will go to paying, these large fees that we have to pay just to get the vaccine looked at by the TGA. Of course, there's still no guarantee that it will get an easy ride through that process. And of course, at the end of that process, there's no guarantee that the government will actually allow the vaccine on the Australian market, because ultimately they completely control that. And as we've said, unfortunately, the signals are that they, for some reason, are trying very hard to give billions of dollars to other players from overseas to saturate the Australian market with only a few technologies. And they don't really want to see these other technologies, which are more traditional, we know are very safe, available as a choice. And we simply don't understand that. And it's great to see Australians coming behind us and saying, we think this should be given a fair go, and are putting their hard-earned dollars behind it.
Now, let's recap again. It's $16,000 just to apply for the right to apply for the TGA to look at the evidence that your Covax vaccine has that sees it in use, approved for use overseas.
That's exactly right. And of course, the $16,000 to apply, to be allowed to apply, is to be allowed to then spend about $350,000 for the real application, which of course gives no guarantee of success and doesn't give any particular timeline. And so you're still have to deal with the additional costs of meeting any requests the TGA may make, some of which may be for additional data, additional trials that might be in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, in order to get that approval. So, this is a long, complex and expensive process. And again, in every other country of the world, it's been the governments that have been paying for this process and supporting the process. Except in Australia, we have this extraordinary situation where the only successful Australian developed vaccine, which is ours, is getting no support whatsoever currently from the government. Not a cent right now. They gave a tiny bit of hush money about 6 months ago, which paid for about 1 day's work, to be honest. But they're providing no support to go through this long and complex process. So we're going to have to do it all by ourselves and with the support of the Australian people.
Now, again, I just want to reiterate, as you've spoken before on the Informer, you're not anti-mRNA. When the brief was initially put to you to develop a vaccine, your team looked at mRNA, you looked at the synthetic protein, you looked at all of the things, and you just found that the synthetic-based protein that Covax is on had the best efficacy and the best safety profile, so that's the path you pursued.
That's absolutely correct. So again, I'm a vaccinologist. I develop vaccines. I'm interested in all of the different ways to deliver vaccines. They're all interesting. They all have benefits. They all or many have downsides. But our assessment was that protein-based vaccines have an enormous safety history. No other type of vaccine technology comes close in terms of the degree of safety and the amount of data on safety over decades and longer. And so not only have we found that the protein-based vaccines are amongst the most effective when you do animal testing in terms of protection against virus, in terms of protection against transmission of the virus, which hasn't been demonstrated for the mRNA. But you cannot get away from the fact that protein-based vaccines are the safest vaccines that have ever been created. And therefore, it makes no sense to sideline those technologies while putting all your eggs in a single basket, which are these new genetic technologies with no proof they're better. I mean, the implication they're better, to be honest, is rubbish. Because there's been no testing head-to-head and we've offered since the start of last year, we'll put our protein-based vaccine head-to-head with Pfizer. In a human clinical trial, we'll provide the vaccine for free, and the government can do a head-to-head study. And guess what? There have been no takers. Why are there no takers? Because they can keep pretending that they're best as long as there's actually no data to prove that they're not. And so it seems outrageous to this day that no one's been prepared to take that challenge on when we're offering our vaccine to be put head to head. If we weren't confident it would win, clearly we wouldn't do that. But we are very confident. We've seen the data, we've seen their data, and we believe that mRNA, it's an interesting technology, but it hasn't been fully developed. We don't know a lot about it, and particularly its long-term effects. And we know that it's wearing off incredibly quickly. People are now needing a third dose. They'll probably need a fourth dose, in a few months' time. Where does that end up? And yet we're not putting any investment into what we know are the best technologies, which are the protein-based technologies. Again, it makes absolutely no sense.
Now, Nikolai, what's termed as vaccine hesitancy, to me, seems like a bit of common sense. We need to consider what's happening. We need to weigh up our alternatives and not walk blindly into it. But it's been portrayed as somehow wrong. It seems that much of that hesitancy would well be addressed by providing an alternative, not with an unproven vaccine or an alternative treatment, but an alternative vaccine that's been approved as Covax for overseas use. Just giving people that choice could well remove that hesitancy, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Now, when we normally talk about vaccine hesitancy and the extreme term, which I don't like, anti-vaxxers, we're normally talking about a small group who often are maybe have less education, are more prone to read conspiracy theories. So, we know that group exists, and it's a very small part of society, maybe less than 1%. What we have here is actually the most educated people in our society. So every second email I get is from, a medical doctor, chiropractors, professors, judges, lawyers, all expressing reservations about, having what really is a new technology that's largely unproven. We don't know the long-term, issues. These are not anti-vaxxers. In fact, quite the opposite. They're desperately looking for a suitable vaccine. So that's how they approach us. They say, we desperately want a vaccine. We're not silly. We've had vaccines all our life. We believe in vaccines. What we don't believe in is, taking on the risk of a technology where it's only been used for a few months. We have no long-term data. It's a completely new technology. No one seems to understand or be able to explain some of the side effects that we're already seeing. If we can't explain a side effect, and we don't, the science can't say, how is an mRNA vaccine causing myocarditis? How can we say it's not doing something else harmful? Because what it's really saying is the science isn't there. It's premature. These have been rushed, and they're still really in an experimental phase. Now, the government will push back and say, no, they're not. The TGA has given them conditional approval. But that does not say that they're fully understood. Otherwise, the TGA could tell us the scientific explanation for how these mRNA vaccines are causing myocarditis. And to this day, I have not heard an explanation that's supported by, peer-reviewed scientific papers saying that side effect is well understood to the point where we know how it's happening, we know how to avoid it. As I say, if that's true of these technologies, then the question is, what else is it that we don't know? And I think we have to be honest. I mean, yes, they're providing benefit, but on the other side, there's a whole lot of unknowns and uncertainty. And an educated person who dives into that may well come to the conclusion, I think these vaccines are premature. I would prefer to have something that has more science behind it, that's better supported by long-term safety data. I want to have a protein alternative. And they're being denied that choice, unfortunately, by our government. If you ask, well, what's the barrier? The answer is, it's our government who doesn't want people to have that choice.
And the fact that the manufacturers of the mRNA vaccines have asked our governments or demanded that our governments give them indemnity from harmful effects. So our government signed it away. Okay, we're not going to hold you responsible. What does that portend as far as confidence in their product goes?
Well, absolutely. Of course, you can't blame large companies for extracting, very favorable clauses. If I'm selling you a plane and I say, you take all responsibility if the engine falls off, it's not my problem, although I'm the manufacturer, you accept the consequences, that would never happen. You would never buy a plane where the manufacturer is saying, you take all liability. If the plane crashes because I've put the engine on in the wrong way, I'm transferring all that responsibility to you. So I think that you're right. Of course, Pfizer, in fact, insisted. They said, we are not supplying these vaccines to any country that doesn't give us 100% liability waiver over any issue of the vaccine. And clearly they did that because, as you say, even Pfizer can't tell you what this vaccine might do in the short and long term. They are truly experimental, whether we like it or not. That's the fact. And of course, they insisted on a waiver of all liability because there could be massive liabilities down the train. And of course, Pfizer doesn't want to have to deal with that. It would be financially damaging, if these vaccines do turn out to have unexpected long-term side effects. So it does signal, as you say, that Pfizer recognize their experimental technologies. Our government refuses to acknowledge that fact. And I think educated people are smart enough to look at the data in their own eyes and realize these are still highly experimental technologies.
And your company, Vaccine and manufacturing Covax, you've sought no such conditions or guarantees with your product.
No. I mean, again, we stand behind it. And, again, we wouldn't be happy to give it to anyone else unless we were 100%, convinced that this is an extremely safe and effective vaccine. I mean, that's the only reason we do this work, and we've been doing it for 20 years. without making any profits, working 7 days a week, to make pandemic vaccines in case there's a pandemic. I mean, again, if we were driven by profit, we'd be selling cancer drugs. Pandemic vaccines are not considered, somewhere to make a lot of money because pandemics, one, occur so infrequently. And as you've seen in this case, we've invested a lot of money in it, but we've received next to no support. So the only reason we're doing this is to try and make a safe and effective vaccine available. And I've even said before, if we have to, we'll give it away for free to other countries, because what we want to do is see it used. And we want people to have access to what we consider to be, the safest and hopefully one of the most effective approaches. And as I say, I can't guarantee whether it will be more effective than mRNA or just as effective because, we haven't had a head-to-head study, but we're very ready to do such a study. If the government or Pfizer or Moderna or one of these other companies, will agree to do that and run a study, we'll provide our vaccine to go head-to-head.
All right, and to close with, Professor, what will happen with the money should you not make the money required to get to the amount to get it in front of the TGA?
We've already, got enough, obviously, to fund the first fee for the application, to make the application. So that will be going in, and we've had a meeting with the TGA and discussed this, that application to make application will be going in the next week, thanks to the funding that we've already raised. Obviously, the total cost of developing vaccines is in the hundreds of millions. So, it's not that funding wouldn't be used for further developing these vaccines, even if, the government do try and put some, block on our ability to move forward. I don't think they I would hope that, they have, integrity and have just, made a mistake in ignoring our vaccine. Obviously, I think it would be seriously concerning to all Australians if it turns out this is actually deliberate and they're trying to deliberately deprive Australians of the only safe and effective Australian developed vaccine. I think people would be asking very serious questions, and I think that would lead into the need for a federal ICAC, Commission Against Corruption, in that event. I'm hoping it's just, oversight. I find that extraordinary because we've been communicating with them, now for over 18 months, but I'm still hopeful that our politicians in Canberra, have some integrity and can realise their mistake and now come in and support, this vaccine going forward. But to date, we haven't had any such indication from, Scott Morrison or Greg Hunt that they're going to do anything to support this vaccine being made available.
All right, folks, there you have it. Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, Australia's leading vaccine expert. This is a ridiculous situation that the Australian government should be embarrassed about. We'll put the link to the GoFundMe page. Get on it. This needs to happen. Thanks for your time, Professor.
It's always a pleasure.